Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, your source for the conservative view on American politics and culture, and where the issues are discussed with goodwill, candor, and intelligence. And now, here's your host, Tony Codispoti.
Thanks, Duke. Hey, everybody. This is Tony Codispoti with the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, and it's volume 75. And today I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. There was an article written in the online version of the National Review by Charles Cook called Bad Press. And it's a tremendous article that just is so laser focused in its criticism of the mainstream media and the problems they're experiencing today, that instead of commenting about this, I'm just going to read it. And I hope National Review doesn't have a problem with me doing that. But it's such a good article, and it's so on point. It's a little long, but every word of it needs to be heard. And I'm going to start reading it for you now. This section is called How the Media Fail. Our national press is a national joke. Vain, languid, excitable, morbid, duplicitous, cheap, insular, mawkish, and possessed of a chronic self-obsession that would have made Dorian Gray blush, it rambles around the United States in neon pants, demanding congratulation for its travails. Not since Florence Foster Jenkins have Americans been treated to such an excruciating example of self-delusion. The most vocal among the press corps ranks cast themselves openly as firefighters, when at worst they are pyromaniacs and at best they are obsequious asbestos salesmen. Quote, "You never get it right, do you?" unquote. Sybil Faulty told Basil in Faulty Towers. Great show, by the way. Quote, "You're either crawling all over them, licking their boots, or spitting poison at them like some Benzedrine puff adder," unquote. There is a great deal of space between apologist and bête noire. In the newsrooms of America, that space, though, is empty. Now, this is the preamble of what Cook is going to get very substantive about. But you get where he's coming from right off the bat. I'll continue. It's getting worse. Despite presenting an opportunity for sobriety and excellence, the election of President Donald Trump has been an unmitigated disaster for the political media, which has never reckoned with their role in the Trump elevation and eventual selection, and which have subsequently treated his presidency as a rolling opportunity for high-octane drama, smug self-aggrandizement, and habitual sloth. I did not go to journalism school, but I find it hard to believe that even the least prestigious among those institutions teaches that the correct way to respond to explosive, unsourced reports that just happen to match your political priors is to shout, quote, boom, or, quote, bombshell, or big if true, and then set about spreading those reports around the world without so much as a cursory investigation into the details. And yet, in the Trump era, this has become the modus operandi of all but the hardest-nosed scribblers. The pattern is now drearily familiar. First, a poorly attributed story will break. Let's say it says, source, quote, source, colon, Donald Trump killed Leon Trotsky back in 1940, unquote. Just as an example. Next, thousands of blue-check journalists, blue check obviously referring to Twitter, with hundreds of millions of followers between them, will send it around Twitter before they have read beyond the headline. In response to this, the cable news networks will start chattering with the excuse that quote, true or not, this is going to be a big story today, unquote, while the major newspapers will run stories that confirm the existence of the original claim, but not its veracity. And if Representative Adam Schiff is awake, they will note that, quote, Democrats say this must be investigated, unquote. These signal-boosting measures will be quickly followed by, quote, perspective, unquote, pieces that assume the original story is true, and worse, seek to draw broader lessons from it. In the New York Times, that might be, for example, the long history of Queens residents assassinating socialist intellectuals. In the Washington Post, it might say, toxic capitalism, how America's red hatred explains our politics today. In the New Yorker, it might say, I've been to Mexico and was killed by a pickaxe to the head. In Cosmopolitan, it might say, the specifics don't matter. Men are guilty of genocide. By early afternoon, the claim will be all the media are talking about, and the talking points on both sides of the political divide will have become preposterously, mind-bogglingly stupid. On a hastily assembled panel, a political consultant, I'm using quotation marks with my fingers, who spends his time tweeting, the president is a murderer. This, period, is, period, not, period, normal. That will go up against a washed-out politician trying to desperately squirm his way around the protean Trump didn't do this, how dare you, but if he did, it's actually good because Trotsky was a communist and anyway didn't Obama drone terrorist position that he contrived in a panic in the green room. And then, just when the fracas is beginning to reach a boiling point, a sober-minded observer will point out that Donald Trump wasn't actually born until 1946, so he couldn't have killed Trotsky in 1940, and everyone will wash their hands, go to bed, and move on to the next boom project. Doesn't this sound familiar? Now, everyone, that is, but the victim of the frenzy, who is usually Donald Trump, but might also be Brett Kavanaugh or Nikki Haley or Ben Shapiro, or the county comptroller from Arkansas, or the children of Covington High School, for example, or someone who just happens to share a name with a school shooter and once complained online about their property taxes, who will complain bitterly about the spectacle and then be condescended to on the weekend shows by professional media apologists like Brian Stelter. This phase is the final one in the cycle, and it may be the most pernicious, for it is here that it is made clear to the architects of the screw-up at hand that they should expect no internal policing or pressure from their peers, and that, on the contrary, they should think themselves as equals to Lewis and Clark. To watch Stelter's show on CNN reliable sources as a reporting debacle is to after a reporting debacle, is to watch a masterclass in whataboutism and faux persecution, followed by the insistence that even the most egregious lapses of judgment or professionalism are to be expected from time to time, that we should actually be worrying about the real victim here, the media's reputation. This, suffice it to say, is not helpful. Were a football commentator to worry aloud that a team's 10 straight losses might lead some to think they weren't any good, and then cast any criticism as an attack on sports per se, would be laughed out of the announcer's box. Look, and here's where Cook really gets into this. Accountability doesn't mean always running a retraction when you get it wrong. At some point, it means learning and adapting and changing one's approach. It's not an accident that all of the press's mistakes go in one political or narrative direction. It is not happenstance that none of the major figures seem capable of playing wait and see when the subject is this presidency. And it is not foreordained that they must reflexively appeal to generalities when a member of the guild steps forcefully into the nearest rake. Ronald Reagan liked to quip that the government department represented the closest thing to eternal life we are likely to see on this earth. In close second is a bad journalist with the right opinions, for he will be treated as if he were the embodiment of liberty. And to that end, think about Dan Rather, think about Mr. NBC over there, I forget his name, Brian Williams. Think about those guys. What are they doing still in the business? I'll continue. That certainly is how they regard themselves. Now, here's a quote from Casey Hunt from MSNBC. She said, "The last person to rule America who didn't believe in the First Amendment was King George III." She said this back in June. Now, this is only true if you discount that the colonists actually enjoyed robust speech protections relative to their English cousins, if you are insensible to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, the pro-slavery gag rules that bound House of Representatives from 1835 to 1844, the Civil War, the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, New York Times Company versus the United States, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Schenck, or Eugene Debs, and most crucially, if you remain wholly incapable of distinguishing between criticism and restriction. Donald Trump, at whom Hunt's quip was aimed, does indeed have instincts towards the First Amendment of which he and his acolytes should be ashamed. He does indeed have a tenuous relationship with the truth, and he does indeed wear a skin so thin as to border on the translucent. But he has not ever attacked the free press. He has not prevented or attempted to prevent the publication of a single printed word, and he has made no attempt whatsoever to change the law that he might do so. Rather, he has repeatedly, and often stupidly, criticized the press corps. The difference between these two actions is the difference between a bad art critic's savaging a painting in print or a bad art critic's savaging a painting with a chainsaw. One is the exercise of liberty, the other vandalism and intimidation. If the media understand this difference, they are doing an excellent job pretending otherwise. In complaint after complaint, the press and the First Amendment are held to be synonymous when they are no such thing and cannot logically be so. Thomas Jefferson, who was as reliable a critic of suppression as the early republic played host to, wrote famously that if it were left to him to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter. And yet, he also contended that nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. This represented no contradiction whatsoever. One can believe simultaneously that the press must remain free and that it has built itself into an ersatz clerisy that regards its primary job not as conveying information in an effective manner as possible, but as translating writs for the benighted public, the better to save its soul. If the polls are to be believed, a majority of Americans believes exactly this. And why wouldn't they, when it's made so obvious? Last year, when the White House unveiled an immigration change that it hoped to persuade Congress to pass, CNN's Jim Acosta showed up in the press room with an indignant look on his face and began to recite poetry from the stalls. It is true that Acosta, a man who seems unable to decide whether he's a political correspondent or a cable on a cable, basic cable, or a member of the cast of Hamilton. It's particularly absurd. But he is by no means an aberration. It is for a good reason that one cannot imagine a member of the mainstream press behaving toward a Democrat administration in the manner that Acosta behaves, and the reason is that he'd never think to do so against his own team. Sometimes consciously, but most often unwittingly, journalists treat Democrats as normal and Republicans as abnormal and proceed accordingly in their coverage. Once one understands the rules, the whole setup becomes rather amusing. When a headline reads, "Lawmakers involved in scandal," one can immediately deduce that the lawmaker was a Democrat. Why? Because if he were a Republican, the story would have made clear that he was a Republican in the headline. Without fail, stories that begin with "Republicans pounce" are actually about bad things that Democrats have done or said, while stories about bad things that Republicans have done or said begin with "Republican does or says a bad thing," and proceed to a dry recitation of the facts. A variation on this rule is "Republicans say," which is used when Republican says something that is so self-evidently true that had a Democrat said it, it would have been reported straight. For a neat illustration of how farcical things have become, take a look at the Washington Post's most recent fact check, which helpfully informs its readers that the claimed 1,000 hamburgers that President Trump bought for the Clemson football team were not, in fact, piled a mile high, as the president claimed, because they're only 2 inches high each, and 1,000 burgers would not reach a mile high. The Washington Post, this is my comment now, the Washington Post actually did a fact check when the president said we had burgers piled a mile high. They actually fact checked that. Think about how stupid that is. And no kidding, democracy dies in darkness indeed, according to the Washington Post, right? Selective political interest is disastrous in its own right. But when combined with the catastrophic historical illiteracy that is rife among the journalistic class, its result is what might best be described as the "everything happening now is new fallacy," which leads almost everybody on cable news and the opinion pages to deem every moment of national irritation unprecedented, to cast all political fights as novel crises, and, provided it is being run by Republicans, to determine that the present Congress is, quote, "the worst ever." Turn on the television and you will learn our language is the least civil, our policies the most divided, our environment the most dangerous. When a Democrat is president, he is facing opposition of the kind no president has had to suffer. When a Republican is president, he is held to be badly unlike the previous ones who were in turn regarded as a departure from their predecessors. Continually, we are held on the verge of descending into anarchy, or reinstituting Jim Crow, or murdering the marginalized, or, particular favorite of mine, establishing the regime outlined in The Handmaid's Tale. Past is prologue, context, and balm. Without it, all is panic. One of the most toxic consequences of this myopia is that both long-standing problems and bad ideas with a long pedigree come to be discussed in the press as if they were unique to the moment. Early in Donald Trump's tenure, the internet was thrown into a flat panic by a host of stories warning that President Trump was marking Loyalty Day. Surely it was proposed that this was proof of his fascistic aspirations. As it happened, Loyalty Day has been recognized annually since 1958, as the law requires. Similar panics have been started by the news that Trump was bombing Syria without explicit congressional authorization, that he was relying on executive orders to achieve some of what he could not persuade Congress to acquiesce to, that he was detaining illegal immigrants at the border and repelling those who became violent. that he reserved the right to use drones anywhere in the world, that he was amending federal websites to reflect his priorities, and that he liked to play a lot of golf. The wisdom and legality of all these decisions and behaviors is debatable, but none of them is new. Even Thomas Paine didn't hope to start the world over again that often. Which brings us to the press's most infuriating habit, its selective defense of American institutions. On cable news, on the New York Times editorial page, at many black tie galas that the media like to hold for themselves, the word is deployed as a cudgel. Institution, institution, institution. At least until it's not. Institutions matter until the Supreme Court rules in a way that annoys the editors of the Huffington Post, who immediately cast the same judges who yesterday were beyond reproach as illegitimate or corrupt, or too male, or too white, or too Catholic, or too rich, or too mean. Institutions matter until the economy produces a result that irritates Paul Krugman, at which point the system is then held to be rigged. Institutions matter until Barack Obama wants to change the law without Congress, at which point the story becomes what the president wants and not whether what he's doing is legal. Institutions matter until Donald Trump wins an election, and then the entire system needs junking and is probably being run by the Russians anyway. Institutions matter until the Senate is deemed an obstacle to progress, or the House disagrees with the president, or the wrong team is making demands, and then nothing is safe. Not even long-standing rules against diagnosing patients from afar. In early 2018, the White House held a press conference at which President Trump's doctor, a U.S. Navy Rear Admiral, delivered a report on the president's health, and in doing so, unleashed the most extraordinary, unethical frenzy in recent memory. At the press conference itself, ABC's Cecilia Vega insisted that despite passing the same test that is used at Walter Reed, Trump might have early onset Alzheimer's and dementia-like symptoms, while her colleagues threw out maladies from which they thought the patient might be suffering and cited the doctors and clinicians all across the country who had diagnosed Trump without even examining him. On CNN, Sanjay Gupta explained whatever the doctors said, the numbers proved that Trump had heart disease. The Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin insisted on Twitter that Trump got a cognitive test, not a psychiatric one, which she said does not rule out most of what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, what's in there. Rubin's speculation was swiftly echoed across the media, which spent the next week inviting experts to take guesses as to what might be wrong with the president. The greatest service that Donald Trump has rendered these United States is to have exposed the many ailments of which he is a symptom but not a cause. We had political division and cultural alienation before him. We had overbearing government and imperial executive branch before him. We had media that were arrogant, parochial, impenitent before him too. But all of that has grown worse since he arrived. And that's the article from Charles Cook at the National Review Online. It's amazing how right on target this was. That's it for me. I'm Tony Codispoti from the Great Vocal Majority podcast, website, and YouTube channel. Please come to the YouTube channel and subscribe, and you'll get a notice every time I post a podcast. Thanks very much for listening. Take care.